Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Grade 12 Life Sciences CAPS series. Thank you once again for tuning in, and I hope that you are doing good out there in your studies. Now, as you can see in this video, we'll be breaking down the human nervous system. So, at the end of this video, you should be able to explain the importance of the nervous system, so its function really, be able to describe the structure of the nervous system, define important terms such as reflex arc, reflex action, synapse, and many more. Be able to label parts of the brain and thus describe their functions, and be able to also differentiate between different nerve cells, label all the structures of the neurons, and there's even many more outcomes that you should be able to achieve. So, without wasting any time, let's get on to it. So, the human nervous system is part of systems that enable us to respond to the environment. So the environment is filled with a lot of changes, and those changes in the environment, we call them stimuli. Stimuli being the plural and stimulus being a singular term. So what do we mean by enabling us to respond to the environment? Well, you could be walking barefoot and to your surprise step onto a sharp object. We all know what the reaction would be, okay? So you would jump off that object or lift your foot off away that object in an effort to try to minimize the damage that could happen. And we all know that this happens involuntarily and it happens very quick. Okay, so this is one of the ways that the human nervous system enables you to respond to the environment. So this is a change in the environment. This is the stimulus that we were referring to. So the human nervous system enables us to respond to these changes. So the stimulus could be a hot stove, it could be a sharp pin. So these would be external stimulus or external stimuli. These are the changes that your body would react to if you'd accidentally be in contact with them. Or the stimulus could be internal. So internal stimuli could be an increase in carbon dioxide, it could be a decrease in the amount of water that is available inside of your body, it could be the amount of salt if salt increases. So these are internal stimuli. Okay, so these are changes that occur that we have to react to so that we protect our body from harm or from damage. So, in other words, the human nervous system enables us to respond to stimuli so that we protect our body from harm. Okay, so that's the main point of the human nervous system. Okay, so if we could read here, the human nervous system detects stimuli, okay, sees these changes, detects these changes, and allows the body to react to these changes. And as I said, stimuli can be external or it can be internal. Okay, we react through the human nervous system. It allows us to react to these changes, whether they are inside the body or outside the body. Okay, and the second function of the human nervous system is that it coordinates, okay, the various activities of the body. So by coordinating, we actually mean that you can walk, hear, see while sneezing, so on and so on. So you can do a lot of activities in one motion. So coordinating basically means that being able to perform multiple actions in one way, okay, or during the same time, right? So this is the function of the nervous system. This is the significance of the nervous system. Whenever you get asked that, this is what you write, right? So now let's take a look at this human nervous system. Now we said that you should be able to describe or explain or break down the hierarchy or the structure of the human nervous system, right? So, human nervous system is quite a complex system, such that it has these structures that have responsibilities, that have certain functions, and you have to know which subsections make up the human nervous system, right? So, the system itself is made up of two systems, okay? So, which are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, right? So the central nervous system is part of the nervous system that is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. So you should think about this. Well, central nervous system. Well, the brain and the spinal cord are at the center of the body. Hence, we say they make up the central nervous system. Okay, so I hope you get that, right? So the brain and the spinal cord, they make up the central nervous system. Now, both of these structures are protected from damage because they perform very important functions that we will look at. So the brain is protected by the skull and meninges. So meninges are membranes that are beneath the skull and serve a function of protecting the brain. Okay, that's what you have to know, that the brain is part of the central nervous system and is protected by the skull and meninges. The spinal cord, on the other hand, is protected by the vertebral or the vertebrae. So we say is protected by the vertebral column, which is the set of bones that protect the spinal cord, that are around the spinal cord, and is also protected by meninges as well, right? So whenever they ask you to state two structures that protect the spinal cord, well, that has to be the vertebral column and the meninges, right? So that is the central nervous system. And remember, central means at the center of the body. And then the other system that makes up the human nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. So periphery really speaks to something that is on the edges or basically away from the center. So if this is the center, then the periphery should be right there, away from that, like that. Okay, so peripheral nervous system, this is a system that is made up of nerves. Okay, so a nerve looks something like this. So this would be a nerve, and inside each nerve you have neurons or nerve cells that transport electrical messages, which we call nerve impulses. So what you have to know here is that the peripheral nervous system is part of the human nervous system, and that it is made up of spinal nerves and cranial nerves. Okay, there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So when we're referring to spinal nerves, we're actually referring to fibers, cubular structures or fibers that connect the rest of the body to the spinal cord. Okay, so they go from the spinal cord to all different parts of the body. Okay, so those would make up your spinal nerves. Okay, so that is your spinal nerves, which are part of your peripheral nervous system. And the other set of nerves are your cranial nerves. Okay, so cranial nerves go from the brain to the rest of the body, right? So we call those cranial nerves. Okay, they connect the brain with the rest of the body, as I said. So these are your cranial nerves. So cranial nerves plus your spinal nerves make up the peripheral nervous system. So you have the peripheral nervous system. As I said, this system is on the edge or away from the center, right? So it's basically made up of these nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves, right, which transport nerve impulses or electrical messages from receptors or sense organs to the brain and spinal cord, and from the brain and spinal cord back to effectors. We'll take a look at those terms as well. So it's as simple as that, guys. Peripheral nervous system made up of spinal nerves and cranial nerves. That is your peripheral nervous system, right? Now, the function of the peripheral nervous system is that it transports nerve impulses from the receptors to the central nervous system, and from the central nervous system to the effectors. And again, we shall explain that later on in the video. Right. Now, the peripheral nervous system is further divided. So unlike the central nervous system, it is further divided. It has other systems that are its sub systems, I guess. So you have to know that peripheral nervous system is divided further into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, right? So the somatic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system that sends impulses, again, electrical messages from the central nervous system to voluntary muscles. So it really controls voluntary actions, okay, such as running, so on and so on. All in all, the somatic nervous system is responsible for voluntary actions. It controls your voluntary actions. And then your autonomic nervous system controls your involuntary actions. So autonomic, automatic. Okay, so involuntary actions such as sneezing, blinking of the eyes, heart rate, so on and so on. Okay, so again, guys, walk with me here. The peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic and autonomic nervous system. Somatic, responsible for voluntary actions or controls voluntary actions, and autonomic controls involuntary actions, right? And the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So, because both of these are part of the autonomic nervous system, that means both of them control involuntary actions, but the sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for an emergency. So, if you are in danger, you know that your heartbeat or your heart rate will increase. Maybe you don't know that your pupil size also increases. So, when you are in danger, guys, blood should be pumped to the most important parts, such as your skeletal muscles, such as your brain, so that you can be able to think because you are in danger. And so the heart rate increases during an emergency or during a fight or flight situation. The pupil size also increases so that you can be able to see clearly as much as you can, because remember, you are in danger. You have to be able to see clearly so that you can get out of danger. Remember, the whole point of the human nervous system is to protect you. Okay, so increase the blood pressure so that the blood flows really fast to where it is needed. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system prepares you for an emergency. It will increase that heart rate, it will increase that pupil size, and it will increase that blood pressure and many more changes to your body so that you can be able to react to an emergency situation. Right, so that is your sympathetic nervous system, part of the autonomic nervous system. And then the other system that is part of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system basically restores everything back to normal. So, after you react to an emergency situation and be able to get out of danger, now your parasympathetic nervous system will be activated. It will decrease that heart rate that had increased. It will decrease the pupil size. It will decrease the blood pressure. So, everything goes back to normal. Okay, so I need you guys to be able to differentiate between these two, be able to differentiate between the autonomic and nervous system, be able to differentiate between the peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. You basically have to know all of this structure, okay? All of this structure right here, all of this hierarchy right here, okay? You have to know each and every single system, its function and its relation to other systems. Okay? Right. So I hope you got everything I said there. I hope that you are following me, guys. Okay. Now we'll take it. Now let's take a closer look at the brain. Okay. So we'll take a look at the brain. You have to be able to label the brain. You have to be able to provide functions of the brain, and that is it. I took this from the Life Sciences workbook. That is a great resource, guys. It is provided by the WCED. So you can type that WCED Life Sciences workbook. It is very useful. Right now, so I hope that you can see these. As I said, should be able to label parts of the brain and their respective functions. So the biggest part of the brain, which is the cerebrum. Okay, so take note of the terms because some of these terms are actually similar. Okay, so the cerebrum is the biggest part of the brain. Okay, so there we go. All of that part is the cerebrum. Okay, Right. Now, the cerebrum controls voluntary actions. Okay. So, any action that you are doing willingly is controlled by the cerebrum. The cerebrum does not only control voluntary actions, but it also receives and interprets sensations from sense organs. You are able to see, you are able to hear, you are able to smell, you are able to feel because of the cerebrum. Okay, so impulses will be sent to the cerebrum whenever you smell something, whenever you hear something, whenever you see something. So it's the cerebrum that allows you to see, that allows you to smell, that allows you to feel, that allows you to taste as well. So all of the sense organs send impulses. They have cells that send impulses to the cerebrum for interpretation. And that's how you are able to tell sour from sweet, a loud sound or a soft sound, so on and so on. So cerebrum receives and interprets all the sensations from the sense organs. So that is another function of the cerebrum. Doesn't only have one, it has three actually, because the third function is that it processes complex thoughts. Okay, so whenever you are solving a difficult question or a maths question, or you're thinking about a complex principle, or you are thinking deep, so memory, processing, complex concepts, so on and so on. That is the cerebrum allowing you to be able to do so. Okay. So the cerebrum again controls voluntary actions, receives and interprets sensations from sense organs, and lastly, it controls higher thought processes. Right. So those are the three functions that you have to know, and you have to know all of them, because the question can say, give a biological term for part of the brain that receives and interprets sensations from sense organs. Or it could say, give a biological term for part of the brain that controls voluntary actions. So that is still the cerebrum. So you have to be really careful when you are studying. Ensure that you know all three functions of the cerebrum. Right. So that is the cerebrum, the biggest part of the brain. Okay, so we move on to the second one. That is this C-shaped structure. Okay, it's like a C, but that is sort of pointing downwards like that. I hope you can see that. And it starts with a C. That is your corpus callosum. Okay, so corpus callosum is this C-shaped structure right below the cerebrum. So the corpus callosum connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain, allowing communication between both hemispheres. So the brain is made up of two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Okay. So the right hemisphere, that is the artistic side, meaning which it is responsible for the creative side of you, drawing, so on and so on. And then the left side is responsible for it's the cognitive part. It's the one that allows you to be able to write, to comprehend, like read, so on and so on. So that is your left hemisphere. So the corpus callosum ensures that there is communication between those two hemispheres, so that you are not only advanced in one, but in both of them. Okay, so that's very helpful. That's the job of the corpus callosum, to connect these two hemispheres so that they communicate. Right. And we head on to the hypothalamus. So the next part of the brain is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, of course, as you can see, is right below the corpus callosum. So it's quite easy to identify as well. So the hypothalamus is the control center for hunger, for thirst, sleep, body temperature, and emotions. So it's the hypothalamus that will make you hungry because your cells require more energy. It's the hypothalamus that will make you sleepy. It's the hypothalamus that will help you regulate your temperature, your emotions, so on and so on. So it has those functions, and it's very important that you remember those, guys. It controls hunger, it controls thirst, sleep, body temperature, and emotions, and it's the only one that does that. We move on then. So that is your hypothalamus. It's quite really simple. Okay, and then we move on to this part of the brain. So that is the cerebellum. Now, do not confuse cerebellum with cerebrum. It's very important that you are able to distinguish between those two. And the cerebellum is right at the bottom, whereas the cerebrum is the biggest part right at the top of the brain. So the cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements. We said the cerebrum controls voluntary actions and the cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements. I need you to note those differences there, okay? And do not confuse those functions with each other, okay? So the cerebellum coordinates, meaning which is the cerebellum that enables you to perform multiple functions in one period. Okay, walking, talking, hearing, seeing, all of those. So it coordinates all of the movements. It makes it possible that you are able to perform multiple functions in one go. Okay. And then the cerebellum also controls muscle tension to maintain balance. Okay, so we will talk about balance when we are breaking down the ear, which is responsible for detecting the stimuli of balance. Okay, so it has cells that detect the stimulus, convert the stimulus to the nerve impulse, send the nerve impulse to the cerebellum. The cerebellum interprets that and sends impulses to the muscles to restore the balance. So it has a function of ensuring that you always have the correct balance every time. Okay, we'll talk about that when we are doing receptors. Okay, so that's the cerebellum. It has those two functions, coordinates voluntary movements, and it controls tension so that you maintain balance. Hope you can see this. I really hope so. So that is the cerebellum. Okay, and then now you have the medulla oblongata. That's quite a word, right? So the medulla oblongata, its function, because it is between the brain and the spinal cord, it basically sends messages, these electrical messages from the spinal cord to the brain and from the brain to the spinal cord. So we say that it transmits nerve impulses. Nerve impulses are those electrical messages between the spinal cord and the brain. So it ensures that the nerve impulses are able to be transported between those two organs. It does not only transfer nerve impulses, but it also controls involuntary actions. Okay, note that what controls voluntary actions? The cerebrum. What coordinates voluntary movements? The cerebellum. What controls involuntary actions? The medulla oblongata. Again, note those differences, guys. So the involuntary actions, we are referring to heartbeat and breathing. There's a question that is quite common now. It would ask you if the medulla oblongata would get damaged, what would happen? So if the medulla oblongata would get damaged, then that means that the only part that controlled your heartbeat is now not working. So you can imagine that you would stop breathing and okay, so that would result in death eventually because the medulla oblongata is the one that enables you to be able to breathe, is the one that enables your heart to beat. So it controls with the heartbeat. Those are the parts of the brain that you have to really know. You have to be able to identify them and you have to be able to describe each and every one of their functions. Okay, so that is the brain. Okay, so we move on from there to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system, we said that it is made up of nerves, and each of these nerves has nerve cells inside of them. So we are going to study. These nerve cells. There's actually three types of nerve cells. They transport these messages from where they are received. Okay, so from receptors to the spinal cord, and then from spinal cord back to effectors. Okay, so we'll take a look at that. Okay, so again, in each and every one of these nerves, you have nerve cells that transport electrical messages. And there are basically three types of nerve cells or neurons. You have the sensory neuron, which is found right at the receptor. So the receptor is the organ that will receive the stimulus. In this case, the receptor would be the muscle of the foot. Okay, this muscle right here. So that would be your receptor. Okay, so they receive the stimulus. Okay, so we're saying that sensory neurons are located right there at the receptor. So that's where you will find your sensory neuron. So a sensory neuron looks like this. So you have to know the structure of the sensory neuron, be able to identify it. Okay, so it has this part which is your cell body. Okay, so the cell body has your nucleus, your cytoplasm. It also has these substances that look like dots, okay, which we call Nissl granules. So Nissl granules basically have RNA that produces protein. Okay, it takes part in protein synthesis. So yeah, so that's the function of your Nissl granules. They have RNA that produces protein. This cell body, okay, so this is the whole cell body. So the cell body continues on as, so we say that it has outgrowths. So it continues on as this elongated structure right here, right there, over there. So that elongated structure is what we call the axon. The axon transports impulses from the dendrites to the synaptic knobs. So again, the impulse, guys, an impulse is basically a message, an electrical message that is transported, and the goal is that we need to transport this electrical message or impulse to the spinal cord. Okay, remember that these neurons are inside these nerves. Okay, so they transport these electrical messages inside these nerves all the way to the spinal cord and back again. Okay, so can imagine the sensory neuron being located at the receptor and transporting that electrical message to the spinal cord. So that electrical message moves within the neuron, within the sensory neuron, inside its axon. Okay, and the axon also ensures one directional flow. Okay, because it's sort of like a canal or a tunnel. So to ensure that nerve impulses do not flow all directions, that they just flow one way so that they get to the spinal cord where they are needed. Okay, so the axon plays that role. But how do we receive this impulse? So the impulse is received by these structures right here. So we call these dendrites. Okay, so dendrites will receive the stimulus and convert it to an impulse. Okay, we also say that in some books you're also going to find out that the receptor is the one that converts the stimulus into the nerve impulse, and then in some books you are going to find out that it's actually the dendrites of the sensory neuron that do so. Okay, so dendrites, they receive the impulse, or you can say they receive the stimulus and convert to impulse. Okay, so it means that this message is received by the dendrites, okay, and it will be transported via the axon, okay, all the way towards the other end. So the other end, this is where you are going to find these synaptic knobs. So be able to differentiate between that structure and that structure. So dendrites do not have circular endings or knobs. As you can see here, this structure has those circular endings. So this is your synaptic knobs. So the synaptic knobs, they transfer the nerve impulse from one neuron to another neuron, or to the consecutive neuron. So this means that the nerve impulse will be transported to the next or to the consecutive neuron, and the consecutive neuron or the next neuron will receive the impulse with its own dendrites. Remember, the dendrites are the ones that receive the impulse, and the synaptic knobs are the ones that will transfer that received impulse to the next neuron, so on and so on. Okay, so now we say that there is a functional connection or a microscopic gap between the synaptic knobs of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron, and that microscopic gap we call a synapse. So it's also called a functional connection. You'd find out they would say it is a functional connection between consecutive neurons, or between the synaptic knob of one neuron um, and the dendrites of another neuron, or of the next neuron. So it's the functional connection, or they say a microscopic gap between the synaptic knobs of one neuron and the dendrites of the consecutive neuron or the next neuron. Okay, so that is what we call a synapse, right? Okay, right. So that is your sensory neuron. Now, the last structure that we have to also talk about is these um, circular structures. They are not really circular; they are rather like rectangular, like that. So yeah, excuse my drawing. So these structures that are in green here, so those are your myelin sheaths, right? So myelin sheath is basically a fat that is wrapped around the axon. So axon, uh, something like that, it's elongated, and then it has a fat that is wrapped around it like that. Okay, so it goes around it like that. Okay, so it is wrapped around it. So that is the myelin sheath, and its function is that it insulates the axon, or it insulates the neuron. So by insulating, so for those of you who don't know what is to insulate, an insulator prevents the transfer of this electrical current, okay, to the neighboring places or sections. Okay, so by wrapping the myelin sheath around the axon, we are protecting the neighboring parts or organs or structures of the body that might get shocked. Remember, this is an electrical message, this is electrical current. So you don't want to shock or damage the next structures or the neighboring structures. And so you have to have a material that will prevent that transfer of electrical current to other regions. So we call that an insulator. So myelin sheath serves that function. It prevents the electrical current to move sideways to affect other regions or shock the neighboring structures. Okay, so we need an insulator there, and the myelin sheath plays that role. Okay, so it insulates the neuron, preventing the damage to other structures or neighboring structures. Okay, so in that way, it's actually protecting the other structures. And so that is its first function, is that it is an electrical insulator, or impulse insulator. So rather, right, it insulates the neuron to prevent damage to the neighboring parts. Okay, don't write impulse insulator. I'm just accommodating for space here. And then the second function of myelin sheath is that it accelerates impulse transmission, meaning which the impulse moves fast because of the myelin sheath. Okay, so the movement is really fast because of the myelin sheath. Is the one that accelerates or fastens or ensures that the nerve impulse is transferred with speed. Okay, it accelerates impulse transmission. Remember, impulse has to be really fast because this is a message. Okay, the message has to get across to the spinal cord that there's something that you stepped on that might harm the body. So this message must be carried fast or transported very fast so that you can be able to react to that. Remember, the whole purpose of this, you want to react to this stimulus by lifting your foot up. Okay, but the message starts here where it is received by the receptor, and then the sensory neuron takes that as an impulse and transmits it to the next neuron. Okay, so the next neuron now is the interneuron. Okay, so it transmits it to the interneuron. So the interneuron will be the next neuron standing in line, waiting for the impulse. Okay, so the interneuron now is located right at the spinal cord and brain. So you're going to find interneuron right inside the spinal cord or right inside the brain. Okay, so it's directly situated in the central nervous system. Okay, so the interneuron does not have a particular structure really. There's many structures of the interneuron. Does not always go. It's not always going to look this way, so it will differ in different diagrams. And it transports impulses. So it takes impulses from the sensory neuron and transfers it to the next neuron in line. So the next neuron in line will receive this impulse via the interneuron. Remember, okay? Inter means in between. It's actually in between two neurons, so it's between the sensory neuron and the last neuron, which is the motor neuron. Right. So the interneuron will receive the impulse with its dendrites. Okay, so they are its dendrites, so it receives the impulse with its dendrites, and it will transfer, of course, this impulse through its synaptic knobs. Okay, so the next neuron standing in line will receive the nerve impulse of the interneuron from the interneuron with its own dendrites. Okay, so the next neuron in line is your motor neuron. So the motor neuron looks like this. It's always going to be like this. Okay, be able to identify these neurons. This is the sensory neuron, okay, and that is the motor neuron. They are not the same, guys. Okay, so I need you to note that difference. Okay, right. So still the same structures because this is the cell body, and those are your dendrites. Okay, so these are the dendrites, and this is your axon, and that is your myelin sheath wrapped around the axon, and that is your synaptic knobs. Okay, so this means that the motor neuron will receive the nerve impulse, okay, by its dendrites. Okay, receives by its dendrites, and this nerve impulse is then transferred through the axon to the synaptic knobs. Okay, right. So the motor neuron transmits impulses from the spinal cord. So now the motor neuron is the one that will take impulses from the spinal cord to back to that muscle there. So there's the muscles that will be able to respond there. Okay, in your foot, in your foot. So we call the muscles that will respond, we call them effectors. Okay, so these are the muscles that will respond by contracting. So they are going to contract and therefore cause your foot to lift or to be lifted up or to move away from that pointy object. Okay, so motor neurons are the only neurons that are connected to effector organs or effector muscles. So the muscle that is going to contract and hence result in you removing whatever part of the body that is exposed to the harm. Okay, so we're saying that a stimulus is received by receptors and it is converted to nerve impulse, and then a sensory neuron dendrites receive the impulse and transport them towards the axon, and then the axon transmits these impulses towards the other end, which is the synaptic knobs, and then this impulse is then transferred from the sensory neuron to the interneuron that is situated right in the CNS or the central nervous system, the spinal cord and brain. And then the interneuron transfers that impulse to the motor neuron. Okay, receives it by its dendrites and transfers it to the other end, which is its synaptic knobs. And then the motor neuron receives that impulse with its dendrites and transfers it across to the effector. Okay, and then the effector contracts, and then you move your foot away from the pointy object. Okay, so that it does not cause harm. So now all of this happens over a very short period of time. Okay, such that whenever you step on something, you immediately react. Okay, so now we take a look at the path of this. Okay, the path of the nerve impulse. Remember, the nerve impulse moved from the receptor all the way to the effector. So the effector is the last part. The pathway of this impulse, okay, that just as we discussed, from the receptor to the sensory neuron to the interneuron to the motor neuron, all of that path it moves along is called the reflex arc. Okay, so the reflex arc is simply the pathway along which nerve impulses are conducted or transferred from the receptor to an effector to bring about a reflex action. So the reflex action is that action that you perform, the action that you do, the quick action that you do at the end to react to that stimulus or impulse. So that is what we call a reflex action, is that quick automatic response, okay, to a stimulus. And the reflex action does not involve the brain, okay, it only involves the spinal cord. So the impulse is sent to the spinal cord and not the brain, because the brain is way too far. So that means you would react way too slowly. You would react after a long time. Okay, so the shorter route is the spinal cord. Okay, so the reflex action, again, is that quick automatic action in response to a stimulus. The purpose of it is that it protects the body from harm. Again, you react to stimulus in a purpose of trying to protect your body from harm. So, guys, here you need to be able to describe the reflex arc. Okay, you need to be able to tell the story. What happens if I accidentally place my hand on a hot stove? What would happen? So again, I've been describing this reflex arc all this time. So what happens is that the receptor receives the stimulus and converts it into an impulse. The receptor in this case is whatever organ that receives the stimulus. Could be your hand, it could be your foot, so on and so on. Right, so it will receive the stimulus and convert it to an impulse, and then the sensory neuron will carry this impulse. Okay, so that is the sensory neuron over there. So it will carry the impulse, right? And then it will also, and remember that it is moving inside a nerve. Now the nerve, so it branches when it gets towards a spinal cord. So this is your spinal cord. So this is a cross section of the spinal cord. So as you can see, the nerve has branched into two. Okay, so this route is called the dorsal route. Okay, this is the route by which the sensory neuron enters through to the spinal cord. Okay, so we call it the dorsal route. Okay, so we're saying that this impulse is then transmitted by the sensory neuron via the dorsal route. Okay, so there we go. That's your sensory neuron. That's the cell body of the sensory neuron. So it is then transferred from the sensory neuron to the next neuron, which is the interneuron. So there is your interneuron over there. It's situated right here in the spinal cord. So nerve impulse is transferred from the sensory neuron to the interneuron, and then from the interneuron to the next neuron, which is the motor neuron. So there's that structure of the motor neuron, the cell body of the motor neuron. And then the impulse is then transferred out of the spinal cord via the ventral route. Okay, the ventral route. The nerve impulse is transferred by this motor neuron via the ventral route to the effector. Okay, so now the effector, it will produce a reaction. So the muscles, okay, of the finger in this case will now contract, and now the finger, you will be moved away from the hot or stove or whatever. Okay, so that is me describing the pathway of the nerve impulse. Okay, so that's how you describe it, guys. Ensure that you mention your receptor, you mention your sensory neuron, you mention the dorsal root, mention the interneuron, mention the motor neuron, mention the effector, okay, the ventral root, right? So that is how you describe your reflex arc. Okay, reflex arc, which is the pathway of a nerve impulse. Simple as that. Right. Now I got this from Mind the Gap. Mind the Gap is also a great resource. So yeah, check that out as well. Okay. Okay, so again, guys, it's very important that you are able to tell the story. Okay, you are able to describe how reflex arc occurs, able to define reflex action, know the reason for reflex action, which is to protect the body from harm, and which is the purpose of human nervous system actually. Okay, now we move on to the disorders. So I hope I made that simple enough for you guys. That is the role that I play. So we move on then to the disorders of the central nervous system. There's basically two of them. You just have to know um, their causes and their symptoms. Okay, so there's two disorders or two conditions that develop due to damage of the central nervous system. That is your Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis. Okay, so Alzheimer's disease occurs when healthy neurons become less and less efficient, not working as efficient or as fast or as effective as they were. So usually you find out that senior citizens or older people would develop Alzheimer's disease due to the neurons not functioning as efficient as they were. Okay. So now some of the symptoms include memory loss and confusion. So you'd find out that people with Alzheimer's disease struggle to um, remember a lot of things. They struggle to remember their grandchildren's name, their kid's name. They become confused, like not being able to tie your shoes, not being able to recall a lot of things. So that is your Alzheimer's disease. So usually, disorders of the central nervous system, you'd find them in your biological term. Give the biological term questions. You'd find them in your column. You'd find them in the multiple choice questions. Right. So you just need to know what causes Alzheimer's disease, which is neurons being less efficient, and also the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, which is memory loss and confusion. Right. Not too much to remember, right? And then you have your multiple sclerosis. So, multiple sclerosis occurs when your immune system destroys the myelin sheath of neurons. Okay. So, again, the myelin sheath insulates the nerve fibers and it accelerates the transmission of nerve impulses. If you're going to destroy the myelin sheath, then there's going to be problem of transmission. Okay, it will be difficult for you to transmit impulses really fast. And so now this leads to the loss of muscle control. Okay, says that even struggle to hold a cup of coffee or a mug. So it's much difficult to control your muscles and also the coordination of the parts of the body. You cannot do a lot of things all at once because the impulses cannot be transferred efficiently. And so you cannot respond to a lot of things. You cannot do a lot of things all at once. So these two are different. Alzheimer's disease has to do with memory loss and confusion. Those are the symptoms. Then multiple sclerosis is the loss of muscle control and coordination of body parts or movements or actions. Okay. So I need you to note the differences between these two guys. In that way, you'll prevent confusing them in the exam. So that is it for the human nervous system responding to the environment. Of course, we are not done with the human nervous system. We still have to do receptors, which are your eye and ear, um, and also look at the processes involved in the eye, such as your accommodation and pupillary mechanism, binocular vision, and in your ear you have your balance and hearing. I'll also take a look at disorders there as well. Okay, so thank you again for tuning in, and I hope to see you on the next episode.